Hi, my name's Mairi Evans and I'd like to talk to you about my research which I've recently completed titled Borderline Normal, the affordances and constraints of autism diagnosis as told by the mothers of autistic girls. My research question was, how do mothers of autistic girls perceive and experience the potential affordances and constraints of diagnosis for their daughters? So why mothers of girls? Well, researchers have suggested that there has been a male bias in the understanding of how autism presents, how to identify it, and also in the creation and the application of the tools used to diagnose it. This has led to girls being referred later than boys, despite parents' early concerns, and also the potential for mothers and carers to be seen as exaggerating symptoms, and the risk of girls not being diagnosed even when a referral for an assessment has been made. Whilst there has been a suggestion that girls' brains are different to boys, and that this has also led to the lower levels of diagnosis, others have suggested that actually autistic girls mask and camouflage their social difficulties whilst experiencing high levels of anxiety and also internalising symptoms. These are then less evident when using assessments which largely rely on observable behaviours. The potential impact on the girls themselves is delayed diagnosis and a delay in the understanding and support that this might bring. For the mothers and the carers of autistic girls, there is the likelihood of a delay in referral, a longer journey to diagnosis, and then also the potential of disbelief from professionals who do not see the overt behaviours suggested of autism. I was curious about how mothers experience this journey. Do they feel their concerns are not taken seriously, or that professionals see them as exaggerating? Do they feel their daughters' diagnoses were delayed and protracted? And do they feel that once a diagnosis has been given, did it bring the understanding and the support that they had hoped for? The age at which the daughters were diagnosed ranged from 4 all the way up to 17, with an average age of 9.25 years. So all 12 of the mothers I interviewed told me that their daughters had experienced some form of emotional or mental health difficulties or challenges. This included anxiety, OCD, depression, self-harm, or suicidal thoughts. And for most of the mothers, these concerns informed the decision to seek an assessment for autism. Whilst there were some improvements following the diagnosis, it was noted that most of these concerns remained post-diagnosis, particularly anxiety. The mothers in the study described a number of perceived constraints to autism diagnosis, or constraints of perception about what autism was or what an autism diagnosis might mean. One of these themes was autism as other, and this was around the myths and stereotypes about autism. Nearly all the mothers talked about the belief that autism was a boy thing before their daughters were diagnosed. Their first knowledge of autism was things like Rain Man and stereotypes that they'd heard in the press, and a view of autism as something that was very visible and observable, people with very overt and different behaviours, learning difficulties, and also there was some understanding of autism as something that wasn't very nice, and one mother even described something around a belief of autism as being seen as something nasty. I have to say these views changed dramatically when their daughters were diagnosed and they learnt more about autism, but this was their first perceptions about what it meant to be autistic. And because of this, the two didn't join up. They knew there was something different about their daughters and they were developing differently, but they didn't make a connection between this and autism. And for 11 out of 12 of the mothers, they had either not considered autism or they'd considered it and discounted it before their daughters were referred for an assessment. All the mothers described challenges in being heard by professionals, and they described schools and GPs sort of saying that what was being seen was not autism, So there were delays in autism being identified as a possibility, and therefore delays in referral. And the majority of the mothers also felt that their challenges that they were experiencing with their daughters' behaviours and the difficulties that they were seeing in their daughters and seeing their daughters have were either blamed on them by others, or they were seen as exaggerating. One mother used the word neurotic, or they began to blame themselves and question what they were doing wrong as parents as well. And in terms of a belief about autism, the majority of the mothers also had fears about what a diagnosis might mean for their daughters, so concerns about stigma and prejudice in the future. And a lot of these concerns were fueled by their own beliefs about what it meant to be autistic, and an understanding that even though their understanding might be changing, that the views of others were likely to still be that of the stereotypical views of autism, such as Rain Man and other myths. Laura said, if you read lots of the stuff about autism or how your child might be autistic, it's very much boy dominated. Well, it seemed to be. It's very much no eye contact, fiddling with small parts of cars. And the assessment, they focus on tiny wheels or something, which obviously doesn't seem relevant. So lots of the mainstream stuff that's been in existence wouldn't have made me have thought that my daughter was autistic. Amy said, in 2010, we did have this lady that came. We filled in some questionnaires. She did a conversation with us. She did a conversation with Liza at the time, with us in the room. And that's when she came up with her, it's borderline normal. And it's important to point out that Liza was not diagnosed as autistic until nearly 9 or 10 years later. And it's that saying that stayed with her mum, it's borderline normal, that stopped her kind of questioning and pushing for more. The perceived affordances of a diagnosis were separated into two main themes. The first, seeking an understanding. This was with regards to the mothers having a feeling that something was going on, something was different in the way their daughters were developing in relation to their peers, and they sought the diagnosis or an assessment for a diagnosis to understand something about that. And there was also the hope that a diagnosis would bring help and support, particularly with some of the challenges that their daughters were experiencing at school and emotionally, and also socially and with their peers. So Lindsay said, I guess we were, why can't she go to school? Why can't she cope? Why is she falling apart? The mothers described a number of experienced constraints to the diagnosis that have been separated out into 4 main themes. The first is confusion and upset, and this was around the time of the diagnosis, so pre-diagnosis and actually in the assessment process itself, which was described as very negative, focusing on deficit language, didn't seem to fit with their daughters, and just added to an element of upset really around the whole process, some of which could have been informed by sort of their belief stereotypes about autism and what it meant to be autistic too. There was a feeling of being left hanging after the assessment as well, and after the diagnosis, with the mothers describing feelings of being lost and being unsupported, and sometimes, you know, just being left with a piece of paper describing their daughter's deficits, and a lack of clarity about what to do next. There was also an experience of the diagnosis not being accepted or understood by others. This included family and friends as well as professionals. And for a number of the mothers, that also included grandparents, which had an impact on the support that they were able to get from family members because of a lack of understanding or a lack of acceptance about the diagnosis. And there was also the lived experience sometimes of their daughters not being seen or experienced as broken enough to receive support. So whilst there were some benefits to diagnosis in terms of bringing support, there were also support challenges, either because support wasn't available or the sense that support was no longer available because a diagnosis of autism had been made. So Laura said that the process of diagnosis was not positive because of how the diagnostic interview is. She said it's wholly focused on their difficulties and impairments and how it's stated and everything else. So that was more of a going through that wasn't good. So Caroline said that she'd been told, oh, there's nothing wrong, you know, just maybe we're making a fuss of it. And Lindsay described sitting next to somebody and talking about their children. And she said, he went, everyone's getting diagnosed with that these days, aren't they? These children, they don't have autism. Are you sure she really has? I don't think they really have it. It's just a convenient category they're putting people in because everybody wants to label everything. The experienced affordances of the diagnosis were separated into 6 main themes. The biggest one and the most dominant theme throughout the whole of the study was the R moment. So this was about diagnosis bringing a new understanding to the mothers about their daughters, about how their daughters experience the world, and how to interpret some of what they saw in terms of their daughters' behaviours. So this brought new understanding, it brought tolerance, understanding about stuff like sensory processing, masking, executive functioning skills. All these things started to make the mothers understand their daughters better, and it made them more tolerant of behaviours that they may have in the past seen as kind of deliberately challenging, and they now saw that this was because their daughters were maybe struggling or finding things difficult or feeling anxiety. The diagnosis brought with it evidence and validation, which enabled some of the mothers to feel more able to go into school or to go to professionals and ask for the support that they believed their daughters needed. And it did bring support. So that was things like school adaptations and particularly things like going to groups such as the Autistic Girls group that they went to and talking to other parents with similar experiences. And another thing that was really kind of significant, I felt, in the information shared from the mothers was how the diagnosis informed their parenting. And they talked about throwing out the rule book or shaking up the rules as they brought in new ways of doing things. And they were less informed by how they thought others believed they ought to parent, and were now more informed by how they saw their daughters needing them to parent them. And the diagnoses helped family relationships, and it helped the families themselves. So the mothers talked about how big family events were different because people understood their daughters' needs differently, and they may not pass judgment or they may adapt things in a way that was helpful. And they also talked about a change in the relationship between themselves and their daughters, and how the diagnosis had helped bring them closer together. And in stark contrast to the earlier theme about the myths and stereotypes about autism as being something kind of bad or negative or even nasty, there were new and positive autism narratives where they talked about their daughter's autism as a superpower and how they owned their autism, and for some how they saw the autism as one of the really positive parts of their daughter's personality and of themselves. So Pam said, it was kind of like entering a new world that had been there all the time, but you just hadn't understood or seen it. So it's kind of like having something lifted off your eyes and you were like, oh my goodness. So for us as a family, it was really positive, and straight away we were like, okay, this is like fueling your anxiety. It's part of the way of how we are operating as a family. So straight away we were like, we learned so much. Caroline, Diane and Lindsay described how the diagnosis had changed their parenting. Caroline said, we were inadvertently getting it so wrong and inadvertently making matters worse because we didn't understand what was going on. We didn't understand why it was distressing her so much. Describing new and positive autism narratives, Lindsay said how her daughter owns it. She said, she's like, yes, I'm autistic. She's amazing, like kind of autistic or not. And I think the things that we find most fantastic about her probably are her autistic traits. We sort of talk about it as being a kind of superpower, but it also comes with limitations because society isn't necessarily set up to accommodate you in everything you might need. So we see it completely differently now. I sort of see it in a much more neurotribe way, but that's not to undermine the significant difficulties that you can still face with it. The mothers gave some excellent advice for other mothers or parents or professionals, and this fitted within three main themes. One of them was it doesn't have to be a lonely thing. So they advised mothers or parents just to talk to other parents with experiences that were similar and to know that they're not alone and to hear and share advice. They also said read and learn all you can, and they wanted to encourage mothers not to wait for an assessment or diagnosis and to read or learn all they can whilst waiting for an assessment. And they all spoke about the benefits of diagnosis, but also that you don't need to wait for the diagnosis to make some of the positive changes and to learn about your child's experiences or to make their lives easier. To professionals, they said be more respectful. And they wanted professionals to be more aware of the emotional journey that they experienced as mothers at all stages of the assessment and diagnosis, and not to presume knowledge that the mothers might not have, and to make sure that information is shared in a timely and useful way, and very importantly, that they make time to listen to their concerns. I think I'd like to end with a word of caution, because whilst there's growing awareness of how autism may present or does present differently in girls, I think we also need to be cautious not to create binary distinctions between male autism and female autism. And this is something that's highlighted by Strang et al., who advise that characteristics that have been associated with female versus male versions of autism are not isolated to one sex or gender, and that we are reminded that camouflaging and masking can occur in the non-binary and male population too. And I think it's important that whilst we learn more about girls and masking, we also don't lose sight of our male population of autistic people who may, or non-binary, who may also be masking or camouflaging. And it's important that they're not lost in our conversations too. Thank you.